going to talk today about primers, particularly the seating of primers is where I'm going to start. Many years ago, and I'm talking about something over 45 years ago at least, we were informed by Spear Bullet Company that primers needed to be seated fully to the bottom of the primer pocket. Now basically, properly dimensioned cases, specifically the depth of the primer pocket, should be such that when the primer is seated, that primer is somewhere around a thousandth or so below the surface of the base of the case. I do not use a reloading press to seat primers. I use a hand priming tool. It was made many years ago that I've had for probably over 55 years. It was made by Lockmiller, and it's got a reasonably short handle on it. The primer's seated properly with that tool, with primer pockets that are proper depth. I always check whenever I seat primers to make sure that they're seated fully. And I seat the primer in the case, and then I turn the primer about a third or a half of a turn, not the primer but the cartridge case and the priming tool, and I come again with the handle, coming down with the handle to seat the primer fully into the case. This method of seating allows you to feel, you can feel the primer seating into the case. Whether there's no tension, whether there's a lot of tension, or whatever it might happen to be, we are able to feel the primer seating into the case. And as cartridges are fired, depending on the pressure, the primer pockets are going to enlarge, and you can feel all these things with a hand priming tool. There are other hand priming tools. RCBS has one. There are other companies that have a simple priming tool. Got a tickle in my throat. And this is one of the major areas from time to time, that create a problem for the reloader. And they think that, you know, that there's something wrong with the gun and or whatnot. Well, I'm going to touch on that. There could be other aspects going on, but that primer should seat fully. And if you look at the bottom side of the primer, which does the ignition, that goes first into the case, you can see that little three-pointed kind of a star, and those things need to just be slightly spread and seated into the bottom of the primer pocket. This is nothing new. This has been going on for a long time. And we have a tendency, various ones have a tendency to find fault in an area where there's no fault. The first area that you need to look, if you have an ignition problem, is if your primers are seated properly. Now, a primer that's not considerably tight in the case, one that's seats a little bit easier in the case, that primer, when the firing pin hits that primer can move slightly into the case. And this may dampen the ability for the primer to ignite. And there are a lot of areas sometimes that had to be attended to. Now, we have other aspects to do with ignition. Some 30 some odd years ago, I don't know, I think now it's probably been about 38 years ago, Remington came out with basic BR cases. They were called BR, and they were in 308. And they had small primer pockets. Remington BR cases. They haven't been made for a lot of years. I used a lot of these cases in bench rest chamberings of my design and so forth. You had to use the hottest primer available, which was the Remington 7.5 bench rest primer, which is a tremendous primer, and I've never found a better small rifle primer than that primer. You had to use that primer to ignite the powders in some of the cases, depending on the capacity of the case. And ball powders aren't as easy to ignite as some of our stick powders, finer granuled stick powders. When we get something over 30 some odd grains, maybe 35 grains in a case that uses a small primer, we are heading off into an area where we can have ignition problems, have kind of somewhat a delayed ignition, which we would call kind of a hang fire perhaps. So another aspect is the double base powders, because of the actual composition of the primer, not the primer but the powder, is very hard to ignite with some of these smaller primers. So that's just some of the area. Now, one of the areas that seem to turn up almost invariably is people have a habit of putting too much lubrication, specifically oil type lubrication or grease, in areas that there shouldn't be any. There shouldn't be any grease, there shouldn't be any oil whatsoever on a firing pin assembly, or the ability for any grease to work its way into that area of the mechanism. Grease and oil confined in a smaller area in relationship to the moving parts with not very much clearance acts as a hydraulic. Well, that hydraulic effect dampens the ability for the primer to be ignited by the firing pin, and you're going to have some problems. Many, many years ago, my first fall down in Trinidad, Colorado, going to gunsmithing school, I went elk hunting with a fella high up in the mountains, and it was quite a lot of weather. Had quite a lot of snow. and he had a 30-06 Springfield rifle, and he couldn't get any of the ammunition to go off. Well, right there on the mountain, because of the design of that Springfield, it's easy to remove the firing pin in the field. And I pulled the firing pin, and it was just all full of, there was a lot of oil. Wiped the firing pin off and so forth. And, you know, by the time he got home, then he was able to clean that out. He's lucky he didn't see any game to shoot, because he wouldn't have never been able to, you know, ignite a round, because he had so much lubrication, so much oil in this mechanism. There are other aspects also. Headspace that's considerably over dimensioned, say something around field headspace, which is considered about 10 thousandths headspace between the head of the case and the bolt face, and even more, that creates a problem. That creates a problem because the case is further forward in the chamber. It's by necessity and by actual dimensional characteristics, it forces that case further into the chamber. So the depth of the indent in the primer is not as deep as a properly head-spaced rifle. The other aspect to do with primers has to do with our extremely high capacity cases. I'm talking about 30 by 378, and the other cartridges designed around that basic case. Cases that big, and even cases bigger. Many years ago, Winchester came out with a primer. This is the Winchester Large Rifle Magnum primer. Those primers were made for those great big cases. Made for powder charges up there in the mid 95 to 125, 30, and even higher grain charge weight of powder. That primer is unnecessary in almost any instance in a normal capacity case. Just because it says Magnum, it is not the same primer. It's a very hot primer designed for those particular cases, and they work wonderfully well. And those big cases, in most instances, require a fairly slow burning ball powder. You know, it's not uncommon for me to have to load, you know, depending on which one of the 378 base cases, whether it's a 30 caliber, a 338, or a 416, or 458, you know, a lot of times when I'm working up loads with the very slow burning ball powders for, say, a 30 by 378, you know, I'm right up there in the 120 some odd grains of powder. That's a lot of powder. Consider that compared to, say, a normal capacity 300 Magnum, which say a 300 Winchester or 300 Weatherby. You know, there we are with 70 some odd grains to 80 some odd grains of powder. There's a vast difference between 70 some odd and 80 some grains of powder compared to 120. Do you understand why that primer was made? There's a lot of confusion just because it says Magnum. Well, most of our Magnum primers are reasonably close to one another, made by all our manufacturers here in this country and in other countries. These primers are very comparable to one another, but not to that specific primer that I'm indicating. Likewise, to do with small primers, the Remington 7.5 has a considerably hotter primer. There's something that you can try. Seat a primer in a case. and in a dark room, or when it's dark outside, fire that primer and see what kind of flash in the dark you get out of the end of the barrel with that primer. And then use, say, a Remington 6.5 primer, or a CCI small rifle primer, anybody's small rifle primer other than the 7.5, and you're going to see very obviously that there's a considerably more length to the flash created by that primer than there is by the other primers manufactured by anybody. They're just simply not another primer that has that type of ability to ignite. But even so, that primer is not too hot of a primer for, say, a straight 222 Remington or 6 PPCs and things of this sort. This is one of the most outstanding primers made, is a Remington primer. There's also some other misconceptions that Federal makes a better large rifle Magnum primer than anybody else. That simply is not so. They make a very good primer, and so does everybody else. Now, your rifle is invariably going to run on a specific primer better than some other primer or primers. And the only way that you're going to find that out is by trying different primers under the same conditions, with the same powder charges, to do with accuracy and your standard deviations. Everybody has a very good Magnum primer. Everybody has a very good standard primer. They're all very good primers. They're not poor primers. They're not cheap primers. They weren't made or intended to be that way. And you know, there are primers that are designated as bench rest primers and so forth. And basically, from a CCI standpoint, and I mentioned spear because things were tied together for a lot of years, basically. You know, the same entity owns both of those companies. Well, their bench rest type primer, those are basically designated that when they've run some ammunition loaded with those primers and they find very close velocity spreads, those are designated as bench rest primers because they meet a tighter, more precision type of a criteria. So, you know, this primer thing needs to be understood better, and this is why I'm explaining some of these things, and why that there are aspects. You know, somebody says, well, these primers aren't any good because they had situations where the primer didn't go off. Well, the primer could have got contaminated. The primer may have not been seated properly in the case. It may have been the firing pin aspect that I'm describing to you. It may have been the headspace aspect that I'm describing to you. The first thing that you need to do is find out where the real problem is instead of blaming the area where, you know, it just isn't so. You see? And this is kind of a human thing to automatically, but once you've been there and done it, and done it and done it and done it for an entire lifetime, over that lifetime, you should be able to figure out some things that are why we have some of these problems. And I've been able to figure these things out very simply, quite quickly. And I'm offering these things, you see, out here to the reloader, the precision hand loader. A precision hand loader is a man that has many years experience. loading ammunition and working up loads and knowing how to properly do it and measure his pressures and use the chronograph and pay attention to every precision detail to arrive at the very best accuracy that's possible. And this is what I do when I build rifles. These are things that are just an everyday sort of a process. Once I build a rifle and work up loads, we're paying attention to a lot of very small, minute, but very important details that give you the precision that you're looking for. You know, we've got a misconception that because you have a high quality rifle, it's got a match quality barrel on it, that you're going to get automatic match accuracy. No, no, no. You've got to have ammunition that is very uniform, that the particular gun at the time that you're shooting it in, that it likes. We've got ammunition that's designated as premium or select or something like that. Well, that's a marketing aspect. It may be no more precision or no more superior, no more select in your rifle than the regular Remington Core-Lock off-the-shelf ammunition that you can buy. So it just all depends how the match of ammunition to the rifle. And another aspect is repeatedly somebody working up a load that seemed like they're just totally scared to death of going up to the maximum listed charge, or maybe a grain or so over what's listed in the book. Every rifle is different. They're not all the same. They're not, the barrels are not dimensioned the same, made by every manufacturer. The chamber is not dimensioned exactly the same, chambered by various methods, whether it's a production method or it's a precision in-house job done by myself. There are a tremendous amount of variations. All these details add up to the accuracy and the results that you're going to get.